Good morning to all. A very warm welcome. My name is Angelos Athanasopoulos, and I'm welcoming you to our very interesting panel discussion this morning entitled Smart Regulations for Innovation in an Era of Technological Breakthroughs, How Can Economies Stay Competitive? And a question mark. I have four esteemed panelists next to me. Mr. Tasos Gaitanis, General Secretary for Research and Innovation from the Greek Ministry of Development. Mrs. Lucine Ovumyan, Senior Vice President and Corporate Affairs and Communications from the tobacco industry. Mr. Javier Lopez-Gonzalez, Digital Trade Lead in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And Christopher Butler, Executive Director in the Tasos Foundation and the Archimedes Alliance. Before we start our discussion, I would like to welcome to the podium the Minister of Digital Governance of Greece, Mr. Dimitris Papastergiou, for an introductory statement. Minister, please.
Καλημέρα. Καλημέρα σε όλους και σε όλους εδώ στο 10ο Φόρουμ των Αδελφών, εδώ πέρα που κάποτε προσπαθούσαμε να μεταφράσουμε τους χρησμούς σε πληροφορία και να χαράξουμε τα επόμενα βήματά μας. Νομίζω πως κάπως έτσι τους χρησμούς των περιορισμών, των ρυθμίσεων πρέπει να εξηγήσουμε στην σημερινή μας ενότητα και να δούμε τελικά υπάρχουν καλές και κακές ρυθμίσεις. Είναι κάτι σαν την χολυστερίνη, ας πούμε, υπάρχει καλή και κακή. Προφανώς κάπως έτσι είναι τα πράγματα και καλό είναι να δούμε ποια είναι η θέση της Ελλάδας και της Ευρώπης σε όλο αυτό το νέο σκηνικό το οποίο δημιουργείται. Η Ευρώπη, η αλήθεια είναι πως το προηγούμενο διάστημα ρύθμιζε. Και κάποια στιγμή κατάλαβε πως την ώρα που σπαταλούσε ή περνούσε χρόνο για να ρυθμίσει, άλλες οικονομίες δημιουργούσαν. Και προφανώς την ώρα αυτή βρίσκεται σε ένα πολύ κρίσιμο σημείο που θα πρέπει να δούμε, να αναθεωρήσουμε, ερωτηματικό, σίγουρα να επαναπροσδιορίσουμε τι ρυθμίσεις θέλουμε και πότε τις θέλουμε. Αν συμφωνήσουμε πως αυτό το οποίο αλλάζει τελείως το παιχνίδι είναι η τεχνητή νοημοσύνη, η αλήθεια είναι πως μετά από πολύ κόπο, μετά από σχεδόν 3 χρόνια συζητήσεων, η Ελλάδα κατάφερε και έβγαλε ένα πλαίσιο γύρω από την τεχνητή νοημοσύνη. Το AI Act έχει σίγουρα ενδιαφέρον. Προφανώς θα μπορούσε να είναι καλύτερο ή χειρότερο, αλλά έχει ένα ενδιαφέρον και σίγουρα αφήνει επίσης ζωτικό χώρο στις χώρες κράτη-μέλη να ρυθμίσουν ιδιαίτερα ζητήματα όπως είναι η άμυνα. Κατά τα άλλα, το μοντέλο της πυραμίδας με την κρισιμότητα των μοντέλων τεχνητής νοημοσύνης επίσης είναι μάλλον ξεκάθαρο. Αλλά αν εξαιρέσουμε ή μάλλον αν αφήσουμε για λίγο στην άκρη την τεχνητή νοημοσύνη, αυτό στο οποίο σίγουρα πρέπει να δούμε πώς θα προχωρήσουμε και εκεί πέρα θα πρέπει να πάρουμε γενναίες αποφάσεις, είναι το κομμάτι των δεδομένων. Διότι η τεχνητή νοημοσύνη χωρίς δεδομένα δεν υπάρχει. Το Data Governance Act, ένας νέος κανονισμός, νέος περίπου 2,5 χρόνια στην Ευρώπη, νομίζω πως βάζει τα πράγματα στην σωστή τους διάσταση. Και καλό θα είναι αυτό να το φωνάξουμε απέναντι σε όλους όσοι μάλλον έχουν παρερμηνεύσει το GDPR. Αν γυρίσουμε μερικά χρόνια πίσω, το 2016, όταν βγήκε ο κανονισμός για το GDPR, ο τίτλος του ήταν κανονισμός για την προστασία των προσωπικών δεδομένων και την ελεύθερη διακίνησή τους. Φοβάμαι πως κάποιοι DPOs, κάποιοι που ασχολούνται με την προστασία των δεδομένων, αυτό το δεύτερο κομμάτι και την ελεύθερη διακίνησή τους το έχουν ξεχάσει. Και αυτό έρχεται το Data Governance Act να πει ξεκάθαρα ότι όλα τα δεδομένα είναι ανοιχτά. Τέλος. Από εκεί και πέρα, προφανώς, προστατεύουμε δεδομένα τα οποία έχουν προσωπική πληροφορία, πνευματική ιδιοκτησία ή, αν θέλετε, άλλα τέτοια ή βιομηχανική ιδιοκτησία. Για όλα τα υπόλοιπα δεδομένα όμως πρέπει να βρούμε τρόπους, και αυτό κάνουμε και στην Ελλάδα με το νομοσχέδιο το οποίο πέρασε πριν περίπου 10 μέρες από την Ελληνική Βουλή, να ρυθμίσουμε διαδικασίες για να μπορέσει πλέον κάποιος να έχει ελεύθερη και ανεμπόδιστη πρόσβαση σε ανοιχτά δεδομένα. Εκεί πρέπει να κάνουμε περισσότερη δουλειά, γιατί το dataset το οποίο σήμερα κάποιος θα βρει στην ελληνική κυβέρνηση είναι πάρα πολύ μικρό. Άρα, ναι, πολύ περισσότερη δουλειά από μια νέα ειδική γραμματεία, η οποία δημιουργείται στο Υπουργείο Ψηφιακής Διακυβέρνησης, με αντικείμενο την τεχνητή νοημοσύνη και τα δεδομένα. Υπάρχουν όμως και καλές ρυθμίσεις, οποίες πρέπει να δούμε. Και είναι πολύ σημαντικό ότι αυτή η κουβέντα γίνεται σήμερα εδώ πέρα και από εσάς. Τα δεδομένα, η τεχνητή νοημοσύνη, τα παγκόσμια δίκτυα και μεγάλες πλατφόρμες έχουν δημιουργήσει ζητήματα τα οποία πρέπει να δούμε κυρίως με την προστασία των ανηλίκων. Και των ενηλίκων, θα έλεγα, γιατί είμαστε εξίσου εθισμένοι. Γι' αυτό και τις επόμενες μέρες θα βγει στον αέρα μια ελληνική πρωτοβουλία που έχει να κάνει με τον τρόπο με τον οποίο μπορούμε πλέον, μαζί με τα παιδιά μας ως γονείς, να τους βοηθήσουμε στην καινούργια αυτή ψηφιακή πραγματικότητα. Το Kids Wallet θα κάνει αυτό ακριβώς και θα κάνει κάτι το οποίο έχει ενδιαφέρον να συζητηθεί και στη συνέχεια. Πρώτον, θα είναι ένα εργαλείο γονικού ελέγχου για να μπορέσουμε μαζί με τα παιδιά μας να περιορίσουμε τη χρήση στην οθόνη. Δεν είναι μόνο τα social, αλλά η οθόνη. Δεύτερον, θα είναι το επίσημο εργαλείο επιβεβαίωσης ηλικίας, ένα age verification tool, ακριβώς για να μπορεί πλέον μια πλατφόρμα να αντλήσει αυτή την πληροφορία και να μην υπάρχουν δικαιολογίες ότι το παιδί δήλωσε ότι είναι 18. Και το τρίτο, και είναι εξίσου σημαντικό, το να χρησιμοποιηθεί ως εργαλείο ελέγχου στις ηλεκτρονικές αγορές, στα e-shops για καπνικά προϊόντα, αλκοόλ και στοιχηματικές εταιρείες. Κλείνω με επίσης μια πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα ρύθμιση, την οποία πρέπει να στηρίξουμε και να διευρύνουμε και ανήκει στο κομμάτι των καλών ρυθμίσεων, που είναι το DSA. Επίσης, μια οδηγία για τις ψηφιακές υπηρεσίες, Digital Services Act, όπου εκεί πέρα ερχόμαστε να λύσουμε, και όντως πρέπει να επιμείνουμε περισσότερο, γιατί δεν πηγαίνει όσο γρήγορα πρέπει, το κομμάτι της παραπληροφόρησης, της δυσφήμισης στο διαδίκτυο, των απατών στα μέσα κοινωνικής δικτύωσης, όπου συνεχίζουν να κυκλοφορούν ανεξέλεγκτα προφανείς απάτες και εκεί πέρα οι πλατφόρμες πρέπει να πάρουν μέτρα. Κάποιες έχουν πάρει, κάποιες δεν έχουν πάρει και θα πρέπει ως Ευρώπη εκεί να επιμείνουμε περισσότερο, γιατί δυστυχώς από τη μεν μία έχουμε την απέτηση να καταργηθεί το fact-checking, τραγικό κατά τη γνώμη μου, και από την άλλη έχουμε μια Ευρώπη η οποία πρέπει να μείνει προσιλωμένη σε αρχές οι οποίες έχουν να κάνουν με τη σωστή ενημέρωση και την ελεύθερη κυκλοφορία της πληροφορίας προκειμένου να προασπίσει τη δημοκρατία. Λοιπόν, έχουμε νομίζω πολλή δουλειά να κάνουμε. Ανοίγεται μεγάλη κουβέντα. Μεγάλη μου χαρά που είμαι σήμερα εδώ μαζί σας. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Υπουργέ, ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Dear Minister, thank you so much for your intervention. I think you gave a lot of food for thought. I would like to kick out on our discussion, starting with Mr. Gaitanis. Dear Mr. Gaitanis, I would like to ask you in a more general sense, would you say that regulation has a positive or a negative impact on innovation from our experience?
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. Thank you for this interesting question. The relationship between regulation and innovation is not unidirectional. And as the same regulatory framework can foster or hinder the innovation, and this strongly depends from the kind of industry or the sector we speak about. So these relationships can be assessed on the case-by-case basis. Let me show you some examples. As the minister said before, we are in the era of AI. In AI, we need an enormous number of data in order the algorithms to perform as best as it can. From my personal experience, when I was a medical imaging researcher, before I undertook the position of the Secretary General, I used to use medical data from US databases. And every researcher in Europe knows that it is very difficult, it is not an easy task to find rich and reliable data, either qualitatively or quantitatively, in European databases. And yes, in this case, the regulatory framework is a disadvantage to make innovation. I do not believe that a regulatory framework in AI is not useful, but we have to effectively balance between the pros and cons. But on the other hand, I would like to be fair. There are cases where the regulatory framework is very useful, and if we take into consideration the intellectual property rights, the IP policies, for example, let's say trademark, copyright, patents, of course, safeguards innovation and entrepreneurs to reap the benefits from their novel services and products, and at the same time, they safeguard them from risking to lose these advantages to others who they did not spend as much time and money as she or he did. In this case, a regulatory framework protect and foster innovation and give an advantage to the entrepreneur and the innovator to have the gain of his success. Summarizing my first position to this interesting panel, I would like to say that we need a regulatory framework in innovation. But the problem starts when we prioritize the regulation over the innovation. So a best practice will be if policymakers, together with the innovators and the start-uppers and entrepreneurs and scientists in general, they sit down together and make decisions taking into consideration all different aspects. So in this case, yeah, the regulation can foster further the innovation.
Thank you so much. And I would like to turn to Mrs. Lucine Ovumyan. Dear Lucine, you're a representative of a major international company where innovation counts so much. So in your view, how should regulations be designed to achieve this right balance that I'm sure all businesses are searching between oversight and innovating?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Good morning, everybody. And first of all, I would like to thank the minister and the Greek government for their, in my view, right approach to innovation. But coming back to your question, definitely we need regulation, without any doubt. But it's very important what kind of regulation. It's very important for regulation not to freeze the innovation, but to shape it properly. And especially when it comes to regulation, when it comes to innovation which affect positively public health. And here I am coming back to our industry, tobacco industry, which today all legitimate players invest billions of euros, billions, in developing new alternative, less risky products for consumers. And here it's very important when regulations support this intention to innovate and to develop newer and better products, because it addresses also consumers' demands and also addresses the public health agenda. Very important for regulation not to be precautionary, but be proactionary. I can give you an example what happens if regulation, when it comes to innovation, is too strict, is restrictive and too cautious. Brazil is a good example. Several years ago, the Brazil government decided to ban all e-cigarettes. They thought that's a simple approach, let's just ban it, and deal is done. But what happened in reality? In reality, the illegal market of e-cigarettes grew by 600%. 600% went to illegal, went to criminality, which is clearly showing that when the regulation is not adapting to the needs of the consumers, is not following the science, it causes absolutely opposite effect. And what is illegal trade, we all understand. It's not only lost government revenues, not only this, it's the gateway to the organized crime and much more severe and bad criminal actions. So the balance is very important when it comes to regulating innovation and common sense, and taking into account that science is developing, the environment is developing.
Thank you so much. And I would like to come to you, Javier, because we know that the OECD, where you work, has recently done some deep empirical work with the World Trade Organization, if I'm right, on the impact of data regulation on economic activity, relevant to smart regulations for innovation. So data flows, also as the Minister said, are critical to economic and social interactions. They drive innovation, inclusive growth also. However, they also raise challenges, especially concerning privacy protection. So I wonder, what are the main lessons from this work you've done? And what does it tell us about agile regulatory governments? Thank you.
So thank you very much for the question, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. So yes, indeed, we did some work on this, and I think we're in good company in the sense of trying to find that very difficult balance between enabling openness while ensuring that there are safeguards. And cross-border data flows is a critical example of countries attempting to do this. And so I'm an international trade economist, and normally I look at trade cost issues and sort of I quantify the impact of regulation as an underlying trade cost. But with the WTO, we decided, okay, well, maybe we need a new approach because, of course, these regulations are trying to attain some legitimate public policy objectives like privacy protection. We want our data to flow internationally so that we can enable the types of benefits that you were mentioning, but we also want it to be safeguarded and to ensure that our citizens are safeguarded when that data flows outside of our borders. So what we did is essentially try to look at this in a more holistic way. And we have three key findings that I think are very relevant to this debate. Now, the first finding is that full digital fragmentation, in a sense that everyone goes their way. We have data autarky. We have sort of the policies that China has been implementing for many years, is something that is going to be extremely costly to the economy. We estimate that if we all go it our way and we have full digital fragmentation, this will cost us about 5% of global GDP and about 10% of trade flows. Now, these are huge numbers, particularly in the realm where I tend to move when we think that trade agreements tend to have about 0.3% of GDP impacts. Now, the second really big impact, really big finding, is that no regulation is also not an option. No regulation is not the optimal solution, because while you might reduce some of the administrative costs for firms, you lose the trust benefits that are associated with the safeguards. So people will not want to do business with you if your country does not have the type of regulation that protects IP rights or that protects privacy. And then we find that probably the most important finding is that the happy middle, where we manage to balance this openness and these safeguards, is one that can lead to global increases in GDP of about 2% and increases in trade flows of about 3.5%. So overall, in terms of the work that we're doing at the OECD and in terms of the recommendations that we're giving to policymakers, is that we need to change our toolkit to be able to assess regulations, not just from a trade cost perspective, but also from the perspective of ensuring the benefits of trust. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Christopher, coming to you, I'm wondering, what's your opinion on the exact role the state can play in boosting innovation? Should it remain confined in simply setting up the appropriate framework for regulation, or instead setting up a more, let's say, holistic plan, which could also involve some critical public financing to improve innovative practices?
So I would take the view to start with that there is a much stronger tension than perhaps people are appreciating between regulation and innovation. If we look at what the source of innovation is, the source of innovation is not regulation, right? Where does innovation come from? It comes from free markets and a motivation to maximize shareholder wealth, or in the case of small startups, in order to make something, to create, and to build something where there is a need. And so when people make money in these startups, or when these startups are acquired by larger firms, this is an expression of value that's expressed through the marketplace. And of course, everybody knows this to some degree, right? But I think that we really need to appreciate very strongly the tension that this is an adversarial relationship. So we should have a very strong precautionary principle. But that very strong precautionary principle should be with regards to regulation. We need to first make sure that we're not implementing a regulatory framework that is going to damage things. The first and most important innovation in the history of human beings was writing. That was the most important and critical thing that we've ever done, and that created the world that we have today and all of its many innovations. And of course, what is the thing that led to the creation of writing? But it's bookkeeping and money-making and the desire of the Phoenicians to be able to chronicle their trade throughout the entire world. And so every time we regulate, what if we had a regulation on writing back then during the Phoenician, when the Phoenicians were planting colonies in Carthage? And we said, oh no, we're so worried about writing. What if writing falls into the hands of the Babylonians or into the Persians? I mean, innovation is additive. So every time at the beginning of this separation, of the lines, of the trend lines of what could be versus what is, we have this huge problem if we put our foot on the innovation earlier in the process. And of course, since time is infinite, the more we put our foot on the scale right now in terms of suppressing innovation through regulatory frameworks, the bigger problem that we could have in the future. And we see that right now in part of the discrepancy between, say, startups in the United States and startups in Europe. The discrepancy is not so bad in the creation of in the startup phase, right? There's a little bit of like around 2 to 1 in terms of startups in the initial phase, but the success rate has declined. The success rate declines in terms of these startups in Europe making it to unicorn status, where they're achieving great success or acquisition by a larger firm. We see that suppressed in Europe versus where it is in the United States. And that is because when they've reached this threshold, that's when they encounter these real regulatory burdens. I think it's also worth talking about, you had mentioned the question about what the state ought to do in terms of encouraging innovation. Well, the first thing is to step back and try to stay out of the way in the initial phase. But in terms of capital and funding, we really need to look at what financial policy is like, what tax policy is like, because these things provide space for venture capital and for capital markets to be able to fund these. So first, if we take a step back again, before we look at what the state ought to do to step in, let's first make sure that the state is not interfering in capital markets through high levels of taxation and regulatory burdens that are making it more difficult for that private capital to step in, which of course is one of the other big problems that the European Union has related to some other places in the world, where that capital is not as readily available for new startups and new innovation.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Gaitanis, allow me to come back to you. Greece has set an example over the last few years on innovation, especially on digital innovation in Europe. I wanted to dive a bit deeper in this and ask you, which are the measures and policies that the Greek government today is using to attract and increase investment in research and development, which will then apply to innovation?
Okay, since 2019, where our party took the administration of the country, our government began with a very well-designed plan to increase these activities. That's why now we have increased by 18% the expenses made for R&D in Greece, taking into account that we put down some specific plans. For example, we created a new legal framework for spin-offs at the universities and research centers. We refreshed the technological transfer offices, again at the universities and research centers, in order to help researchers and university professors to make their own firms, their own startups, and to create added values using scientific results. At the same time, we announced highly budgeted research grants put together the private sector and the universities and research centers to work together on research projects. We introduced the Elevate Greece, which is the company under the General Secretariat of Research and Innovation, who is the hub for the Greek startup ecosystem, and Elevate Greece has the registry of the Greek startups companies. Very recently, we introduced a new legal framework for the Golden Visa. Now, Greece offers the possibility to foreign investors to put 250,000 euros, at least 250,000 euros, to one startup company of the registry of Elevate Greece, and to get a golden visa for 5 years. What else? We offer the most enormous tax initiatives, tax exceptions in Europe to the private companies to invest in R&D activities. This initiative starts from 200% to 350%, and this is another initiative for private sector to invest in R&D in order to be more competitive in the modern era. This time, the expenditure in R&D in Greece is at the half of the European level. We were close to 1.5%. Half money come from private, half money come from public sector. We would like to boost further the private sector to go to 65% approximately, which is the European average. So we have to do a lot in the next future. But since 2019, we have did a lot, and I think that at least the Greek ecosystem grows progressively.
I believe that the word revolution describes this pretty well, actually. It is well known in Europe these days. Lucine, allow me to come back. You know very well that the OECD has recommended this set of agile regulation principles to hasten innovation. The question is, how does this apply in practice, especially in such a big industry like yours?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I look at regulation as a map, and to stay useful, it has to be updated regularly. And OECD regulatory model, this agile regulatory model, is exactly about this principle, that the regulation should evolve. It shouldn't be a wall, it should be a framework that helps the innovation to progress, which is based on science, which is based on evidence, which is promoting open dialogue and consultation. So it's exactly what and how it should be. And when it comes to our industry, talking about novel nicotine products, it's very important if regulation adjusts in line with the progress, in line with the innovation. I can give you a very good example of the Philippines. They introduced the legal framework which refers to international standards, which means if there is any progress, any new products appearing in the world and in the local market, they do not need to start the whole very heavy legalistic process and adopt a new law to regulate the new product. They refer to international standards in a very agile manner, and it suits everybody. It is fast, it is simple, and it follows common sense. But there are also bad examples. Let's take Indonesia. They decided that all novel products, in all novel nicotine products, should be regulated the same way as cigarettes. It's coming from the tobacco industry, it's bad, let's just regulate it the same way, which is killing innovation. And it's not serving neither public health interests, nor the consumers, nobody. And it's like to say that all means of transport are the same, whether it's a plane or a bicycle, let's regulate and have exactly the same rules for all. Does it make sense? It doesn't. And definitely this type of approach is just killing innovation and opening, again, doors to illegal trade, to criminals. So if all the countries around the globe would really promote and follow this OECD agile regulatory model, I think we all will have brighter future together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And it's good that we have OECD in our panel and take this a little bit further. Javier, it seems that there is today a global urgency, in the EU even more, I would say, to somehow deregulate, to simplify the bureaucratic burden, to cut red tape in order to remain competitive. As I said, we just see this even more in Europe. I believe we also see it in the US. But in the meantime, we have seen that over the last few years, there's been a lack of trust, an increasing, I would say, lack of trust, concerning the impact of globalization in global well-being. And this happens also in the West. I wonder if we run a danger here of alienating our citizens in a moment when many of them are already concerned that maybe modern technologies like AI are threatening their jobs and their way of life. What do you think?
So I think there's a lot to unpack in that question. And perhaps I can start where I left off with some of the empirical findings from the work we've done on cross-border data flows. No regulation does not seem to be the answer. So when you're faced with that question, then what is the right level of regulation, and what is the right level of regulation taking the OECD hat globally that enables the benefits of innovation while maintaining these kinds of safeguards? And sort of while I'm not going to give you sort of the golden answer, the $1 million answer, I am going to give you a set of principles that we've uncovered in the work that we've done on cross-border data flows and digital trade writ large, which tend to be associated with trying to find that balance. And the first one is about transparency. And it's silly to say, but you need to be very clear of what you're doing, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it. And you'd think that that would be the bedrock of everything, but yet you see a lot of regulation that's still not completely clear in all of these areas. Now, the second one is that you need to have what we call a least trade restrictive test. I think that's really important to ensure global innovation. That is to say that to attain the objective, the legitimate public policy objective you have in mind, that you think about, is there a less trade restricting way of attaining this legitimate public policy objective? Sort of that's a really, really important one to make sure that we're not stifling global innovation. The third one is that good regulation needs to be non-discriminatory. There's no reason why I should be discriminating between domestic firms and foreign firms, and importantly, no reason why I should be discriminating between my partners. If I want the regulation to attain something, it should be the same for domestic firms and for all international firms. And last, and this is something that is extremely important increasingly in this world of we're regulating at different speeds on different issues, is to try and draw the issue of interoperability into the discussions, and try to do this perhaps in the same way that GDPR has this notion of sort of privacy by design. We need to think of the notion of interoperability by design to ensure that these regulations can talk to each other and that we're all sort of peer learning so that we can have this more agile regulation in place. I think that if we follow these simple rules, we can go a long way in terms of minimizing the negative impacts. It's perhaps easier said than done, but I think these are the bedrock principles that we need to think about when we're setting our new agile regulation on these very difficult issues.
Thanks so much. Christopher, in the effort to nurture innovation, where do you think the priority should be given when the regulatory governance framework is initially built? Startups first, small and medium-sized enterprises and mid-caps maybe, or maybe to bigger enterprises that possess already a comparative advantage and they could use these to lead to the creation of national champions. What's your take on this?
So, I mean, they're very closely related. Javier talked about non-discrimination a little bit. Unfortunately, some of the European initiatives are really focused on some of the big gatekeepers, specifically DSA and DMA, for example, which have created a lot of problems for additive European innovation. So there's kind of an inherent discrimination in looking at these large international organizations, mostly based in the United States, with the feeling that there must be a more intense regulatory pressure brought to bear on them. And a lot of this is actually related to trying to derive revenue, a related question for the European Union. But this intense level of focus on these big players that you talked about has created a lot of problems for the startup community. So a big engine for the startups growing up and becoming these unicorns is the prospect of eventual acquisition from one of the big entities. And so if you have this intense regulatory framework on the big players with the presupposition that we're going to have a permanent polyopoly among these large firms, you're never going to have the opportunity for the startups to grow up in the first place and to create differing power structures. If you have these thresholds that people rise and cap, funding is not going to flow into those organizations, to those startups and those mid-sized firms before they can hit that cap. So what's going to happen is those other firms that are existing already, the larger firms that have the ability to have full-time staff that's interacting with governmental entities, they're going to have permanent market ossification in this realm. So I think that if you try to focus on the big firms and facilitate the little ones, ironically, you're going to create so many problems for the startups and these growing new entities.
Thanks so much. It's great you have been so disciplined on the timing. So this allows me to conclude with a question which I would like to address to all of you. I think it was a few years ago that a book named The Brussels Effect by Anne Bradford described the European Union as an entity which has created a super regulatory framework, and this was actually the future. But we see that since the last European Commission took place, we have an effort to simplify, I wouldn't say deregulate so much. We have all these regulations that they need to be at least adjusted to the new reality. And we have also two reports by two former Prime Ministers of Italy, Mr. Draghi and Mr. Letta, talking about all this. So, starting this time by Lucine, my question would be, how do you see the EU doing in attracting investments and creating competitive advantage for its companies, the companies which work in the European Union, through innovation-friendly policy making? Lucine.
It's a very important question. And you rightly mentioned that it's getting better, and regulators in EU, they realize that very heavy bureaucratic processes, they are not attracting investments, they are not promoting innovation. They are killing intention to innovate and to progress in some instances. But unfortunately, still, still many regulators in the EU take an approach of threat when it comes to innovation. They say, okay, it doesn't create, they do not look at from the perspective of creating an opportunity, but more that it can create a threat, should be regulated. And as everybody today talked about, definitely we need regulations, we need boundaries, we need frameworks, but we need it in a smart way. So to answer your question, it's getting, in my view, better. For example, sustainability reporting regulation now will be reviewed and simplified. Very important, because it's just killing legitimate businesses with all this bureaucratic burden. And non-legitimate businesses, they just take advantage from this because they do not comply with any type of regulations. So it's improving. I can give you another example, single-use plastic directive. On one side, yes, it introduces a penalty. You have plastic, you have to pay. But on another side, it promotes innovation, because the businesses now try to find the way how to create products without having this plastic. So this is, I think, it's a good balance. It's a healthy approach. So in a nutshell, more agility, more science-based approach regulators will apply in the EU, more investments will be coming here, more desire, businesses, people will have to innovate and to progress.
Thank you. Javier.
So let me perhaps draw on where you finished on this idea of agility and maybe introduce an idea of flexibility. My sense is that there is a potential for, in Europe, thinking about changing regulation in a way that is commensurate with what's happening internationally. And what I mean by that is that sometimes there is an issue when you look at it from a global perspective that the EU, the European Commission, comes to the table to discuss things and says, right, we're ready to open up and discuss how we deal with this very big problem because we've just solved it amongst ourselves. But we're only able to negotiate to our level because it's too difficult to go back and change the negotiating process. And I think that what we need to find, or what the EU needs to find, is sort of a process of ensuring that there is an agility where you can come to the table to talk about global problems and readapt the regulation, peer learn, and identify ways of moving forward. And maybe to shamelessly plug, the OECD is a good body to do this. It's a good place where we learn from each other and we try and tackle these very difficult problems, and we try and find ways of making our regulations a bit more agile.
Secretary General.
In research, simplicity and flexibility are very crucial parameters. Last November, I was visited back-to-back Silicon Valley, Brussels, and the different in risk and the bureaucratic processes were very, very obvious. So we have to try more in order, and of course, according to Draghi and Leta's report, to pay more attention in order to reduce all the bureaucratic procedure in research, especially in reviewing processes, in order to be more quick. Because, you know, in research, an idea is innovative at the time where the scientists write it down in the paper and for the next months. So after that, the idea is obsolete, or someone else have done what you have imagined. So we have to try more in order to reduce the bureaucratic procedures and to pay more attention to review the ideas, the scientific ideas, and we are looking for the excellence in research. And we have not to pay attention, we must not pay attention to documents in order to evaluate the financial situation of the firms or the other academic entities. So I'm optimistic that the European Union, especially under the new geopolitical conditions, will get the message, and all together we will do the right thing.
Thank you. Christopher, last but not least.
So part of the argument for the Brussels effect is what what Brussels does not only affects Europe, of course, but the rest of the world. And I think in the immediate aftermath of some European projects like GDPR and the AI Act, we saw attempts to replicate that in other places. Like, this is something that's being done anyway. We might as well look to see that the regulatory framework is something that's advantageous. And so you saw, for example, GDPR implemented in California, something extremely similar to GDPR implemented in California. You saw something like the AI Act replicated in Illinois and Colorado, although much less exhaustive. I would say that you have something going on now as you have seen this divergence in tech innovation and GDP growth that's developed between the EU and China and the US and the EU, that there's almost a reverse Brussels effect that's going on now, where there's a little bit of a chilling effect. Things like the data sharing mandates, for example, that have created a lot of problems. And if you look at, the data sharing mandates seem to be having an effect of suppressing patents, patent registrations. If you look at year-by-year patent registrations in China, you're looking at about 1.7 million a year versus about 200,000 in the European Union. The US is somewhere in between. I forget what the number exactly is. But you're seeing this divergence that's growing, and so it has a multiplication effect. This is becoming much more widely known, this divergence in tech innovation, to the degree that when just last year, or actually it was the last session in Texas in the United States, when an AI bill was under consideration that was believed to be a much more felicitous type of AI regulation that would provide meaningful guidelines for people to be able to innovate in Texas. This idea that it was compared in the press so much to the AI regulatory the EU regulatory framework, that this was enough to kill the bill under its own weight, separate from the merits of the bill. And even in states that might be more predisposed to follow the European example, just to talk about the US example, looking at places like California, you're seeing this really motivate people as being a concern. And my concern for the EU is, as I said, that the technology is so additive that if these cleavages continue to grow, the entire world is going to be in a really much worse situation from an innovation perspective. I think that the EU, Latin America, the United States, and East Asia outside of China really need to be fostering a spirit of really intense cooperation if we're not going to be left behind by more totalitarian regimes that have the ability to be more agile because they don't have to deal with niceties of democracy and things like that. So we really have to be very careful about this, about the Brussels effect. I think that Brussels has a tremendous responsibility to lead, and it ought to lead to some degree by being a little bit more deferential on these questions.
I would like to thank you all for your contributions today. I would like to thank the Minister for his intervention. Thank you all for being here with us.
Thank you.